Well, as you know, this is a time in our calendar for transitions, for endings, and for beginnings. We just began a new year. Today, Shmini Atzeret brings the Sukkot holiday to a close. Tomorrow morning, down at MPAC at University Circle, we are going to have the consecration of our first graders with a class of 41, the largest class we've had in many, many years. So not only is this a new beginning for our children, but it is a new beginning magnified by the fact that we have so many kids. And even though you may not have anybody involved in consecration tomorrow, I encourage you to think about coming down. We start at 10 o'clock. It's a beautiful, powerful service of beginnings. The music is wonderful, and everybody who comes down enjoys it. On Sunday morning, also at 10 o'clock here, we're going to have our Simchat Torah celebration, and as you know, on Simchat Torah, we end the reading of the Torah, and without interruption at all, we are going to begin anew. Endings and beginnings. What we've generally done in the past many, many years is we've opened the Torah scroll around the entire perimeter of the congregation, and somebody, this year will be me, gives us a quick run-through from the beginning to the end. And the way we've done this is somebody reads at the very end of Deuteronomy, all the way around here in the sanctuary, and then somebody else reads the beginning of Genesis over there to the right, the bema being there, if you're following my picture here. This year, Rabbi Dadun, in her eagerness to have as little gap as possible between the end and the beginning, is going to read both, and she's going to run from one to another. In case I forget to do this, somebody please remind me to get out of her way. Okay. And so we now approach the very end of the 5 books of Moses with the last Torah portion in our cycle of readings. And I want to talk a little bit about the last chapter of Deuteronomy, the last chapter in the 5 books of Moses, talk about it a little bit, and then I want to raise a question about just what kind of ending this is. As we probably recognize, the way in which an author or a poet or a composer, for that matter, begins and ends a piece is significant. By what springboard does the whole thing begin? And how does the author bring it to a conclusion? And so I want to talk about this a little bit, and then I want to raise that question. So I'm now in chapter 34 of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses went up from the steppes of Moab to Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is on the east bank of the Jordan River, current Jordan, to the summit of Pisgah. He's going up on a mountain opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land. Now picture this. Let's suppose for a moment that I'm Moses. I'm facing west because from Jordan, it's west to the land of Israel. There's the Mediterranean. God is now showing him parts of the promised land counterclockwise, beginning here and going all the way down the west, the banks of the Mediterranean and back up to where he is. Showed him all the land, Gilead, as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the whole land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Mediterranean, the Negev and the plain, the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Sohar. Gives him a panorama of this land. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," bringing those promises way back from Genesis now to its climax. "I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross over there." And you remember why. In Numbers chapter 20, Moses committed some sin so heinous that he loses his right to enter the promised land. And as I've pointed out on several occasions, our commentators are worried about just what that crime is to rise to the level of not allowing him to complete his mission. But nevertheless, he will not cross over. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, Eved Adonai, the highest accolade that can be given to any individual in the Bible, serving God. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the Lord. God had already said, "You are going to die," at the command of the Lord. But the Hebrew is al pi Adonai, literally by the mouth of God. And the rabbis then speculate or understand this to be that God kissed Moses asleep. Al pi, by the mouth of the Lord. So even though God's decree, "You shall not go into the land," was severe, nevertheless, God modifies the severity and perhaps modifies his own pathos at having to follow through on this punishment by this last act of intimacy with Moses. And in our tradition, there is the idea of a neshikat mitat, dying by a kiss. And it applies to an easeful, unpainful, unprolonged dying process. We call that dying by the kiss of God, right here from this passage. He, God, buried him in the valley of the land of Moses. God actually, according to this, did the burying. And why? Near Beit Peor. And no one knows his burial place to this day. So that since human beings did not perform the last rites and bury him, only God did, it's a secret as to where Moses lies. And of course, that's very significant, isn't it? Because the grave of a figure like Moses can become a shrine. And people will go there and pray at that shrine, even pray to Moses. And the authors of the Torah seem to want to prevent that. Nobody knows where he was buried to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. 120 is a magic number. Already at the beginning of the story of Noah in Genesis chapter 6, God reduces the age range to 120 at the outside. You remember, Methuselah lived to 969. Noah lived to 950. The pre-flood exorbitant lifespans. And now the outer limit is 120, which Moses achieves as a sign of his preeminence. Mathematics is very important to understanding biblical literature. At one point, I will show you how the ages of the patriarchs follow a formula. 120 happens to be 5 factorial. 5 times 4 times 3 times 2. These mathematical ideas are not coincidences or mere fluff, because mathematics shows us a certain kind of orderliness, and the mathematical figures reflect the orderliness of the universe. And therefore, when we find something intriguingly mathematical, we recognize that the authors are trying to symbolize some larger order. And the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab for 30 days. The rabbis point to a difference between the mourning for Aaron when he died and the mourning for Moses. For Aaron, in Numbers chapter 20, it says, the whole community mourned for Aaron. For Moses, it says, the community. What's the difference? Well, think of Moses and Aaron, for example, at the episode of the golden calf. Moses is enraged because the Israelites have violated a fundamental norm, the unity of God. And through that rage shows a kind of separation between Moses and the people. He offers high standards. The people are having trouble living up to those standards. A strong leader creates in some way or another some alienation from the people he's trying to lift, trying to lift. Whereas Aaron accedes to the needs of the people. When Moses challenges Aaron, why did you do this? Why did you take gold and make a golden calf? Aaron's response was, the people are weak. They didn't know where you were. So I tried to mollify them until you came down. Who mourns for Aaron? The whole people. Who mourns for Moses? The people. And therefore casting a subtle difference between their affection for Aaron and lesser affection for Moses. The period of wailing and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him. By doing that, either pointing to Joshua as the successor, see, I'm putting my hands on Joshua, or it could be this idea of transferring, in some real terms, the spirit of Moses onto the spirit of Joshua. And this idea of smicha, laying on of hands, which Moses does to Joshua, is what we call ordination today. When I was ordained, when rabbis are ordained, the Rosh Hashiva, the president of the rabbinical school, laid his hands on us in emulation of this act. And the Israelites heeded him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. The transfer of power, authority, leadership is now complete. Here comes a eulogy now for Moses. Final words. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses. Now, how does the author know that? He doesn't know it. This is a doctrinal assertion. The author is claiming the utter uniqueness of Moses as a doctrine. And so, with the utter uniqueness of Moses comes the utter uniqueness of what Moses brought, the Torah. That there will never again become a prophet like Moses is equal to there will never again be a literature comparable to the 5 books of Moses. And therefore, when Moses dies, the preeminent revelation ends. And I'm going to quote to you from the book of Numbers about Moses. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I, God, make myself known to him in a vision or in a dream, indirectly, symbolically. To the prophets, God gives partial knowledge, although through a glass darkly to some degree. And the prophet, him or herself, there are 4 prophets in the women prophets in the Bible, adds his or her own context, language. Isaiah speaks the language of the temple, the language of the city. Amos speaks the language of the of the hills, of the shepherd's land. Okay? So when a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision or in a dream. Not so my servant Moses. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles. Think of this locution, mouth to mouth. So you and I are having a conversation. You say something to me, it goes into my ear, and then I speak it to another. It goes into his or her ear, he or she passes it on. We've all played the telephone game, and we recognize that this process doesn't take too long for the initial message to be transformed. Where the transformation happens is in this interval between ear and mouth. I hear it, it comes into my mouth, and I tell it to another. This is where interpretation happens. God doesn't speak to Moses mouth to ear. He speaks to Moses mouth to mouth, so that Moses is the cipher through which the word of God comes to others. Without any interpretation, that's the implication. And so you can see how the orthodox, the traditional view that the words of the Torah are the very words of God comes out of this idea of from mouth to mouth. Here is another way of talking about the utter singularity of Moses. When Maimonides goes to write his 13 principles of the Jewish faith, and you'll recognize the fact that when there is an odd number of items in a series, there is a middle number. Out of 13, 6, 1, 6, right? So the 1 is number 7 in the list of 13. And the number 7 in Maimonides' 13 principles of the Jewish faith is the preeminence of Moses, the fulcrum, the pivot around which the entire enterprise swings. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord singled out face to face. For the various signs and portents that the Lord sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed before all Israel. Never again. I want to briefly raise the question to which I pointed at the very beginning. What kind of ending is this? And I'm going to suggest at least two possibilities. It's a comedy or it's a tragedy. Now, I'm taking both of these as ways of understanding the world. These are two great alternatives for a vision of how things are. And I'm going to point out quickly what happens at the very end of Plato's dialogue, the Symposium. When Socrates says to the two interlocutors, after a long night of conversation, they're drowsy and they're almost falling asleep. But Socrates is saying to them, one, the comedic author, Aristophanes, and the other, the tragic playwright, Agathon, that a genius should be able to write both comedy and tragedy. This suggests that there's similarities between them as well as differences. What's the similarity? Socrates doesn't say, but I'm going to speculate on it. Both deal with the imponderable dilemmas of life. For tragedy, those dilemmas are intolerable. For comedy, they're tolerable. Both recognize the problems. For tragedy, the end is the end, and the terror lives on. For comedy, we can reconvene community, marriages will take place, and in spite of the conundrums of life, we can go on. Think about this first of all, possibly this last chapter is a tragedy. What are some of the elements of tragedy? A tragedy ends with the protagonist's death. That's true about Moses. The action of the drama is serious and complete. And that's true about this story, which has wrapped up Moses' life. And the calamity that befalls the hero is a result of the hero's own action, oftentimes reflecting excessive hubris. Why does Moses not get into the promised land? Because he said, "Shall we bring water from the rock?" And according to one commentator, this is an act of hubris, of excessive pride, as if we are bringing water from the rock and not God. So elements of this story can reflect a tragic vision. All the more so if that protagonist has sterling qualities next to a fatal flaw. And a tragedy, as I've just said, represents the end. At the end of Othello, after Othello kills Desdemona and himself dies, if they both survived, what would they talk about the next morning at breakfast? Pass the butter, honey. Did you see what happens in the front page of the newspaper? We can't imagine they're going on because tragedies end without continuity. What about comedy? Comedies have happy endings. The community gathers. Comedy presents an orderly and ordered world. Ultimately, there's coherence and harmony. Comedy brings back into the picture promise and the possible fulfillment. What happens here? Yes, Moses dies, but the people are now poised to go over and to continue the story. New leadership has been proclaimed, the Torah has been given, and Joshua is now a warrior with the Torah in his hand. What about Moses? Yes, Moses dies, and one might say it's a tragedy for Moses. But here's an idea. One political theoretician says about this story that when Moses dies, he disappears into his book. If we turn the page and begin the book of Joshua, in the first several verses, Moses' name is mentioned 7 times. I'm going to read the first verse. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' attendant. So Moses' life, if you will, goes on. There's a continuation even for Moses, who, though we die, his legacy lives on, and thereby he lives on. So, I'm going to suggest to you that the end of the 5 books of Moses is a comedy, just as the end of the entire Bible is a comedy. Life, for all of its dilemmas, all of its impediments, all of its problems, all of its calamities, goes on the next day. If Othello were a comedy, we would see Othello and Desdemona at breakfast the next morning. Because if we turn the page from the end of Deuteronomy, we come to the next movement where Joshua prepares the people for going over the Jordan River into the promised land. And I suggest to you as something of a challenge, and you may want to investigate further the nature of comedy and tragedy and see if you come to agree with me that the Bible is a comedy, even though it does not appear to be.